Okay, hi everyone, it's Coach Jim, and today I'm going to talk about research. Okay, so why is research important? I'll also talk a little bit about evidence packets, how to use them, and that sort of thing. So we're not experts in many things. And what I mean like an expert, like unless you have like a high level PhD or expertise, there's probably more people who know something about a certain debate topic than you do. No offense, but sometimes it's really important to bring in outside sources to help establish your ethos, or also known as your credibility in making arguments. Also, it's always really good, especially in a utilitarian like cost benefit debate, to have some sort of statistics that you can quantify your impacts with. And it also, always gives you a chance to find new arguments, especially if you're doing a format of debate where the topic doesn't change very much, like, policy, where it's like all year long, or, even Lincoln Douglas in that second month of debating the topic. They're usually, after a few tournaments, you realize that a lot of the arguments are redundant, and a lot of teams are basically saying the same thing every single round. At that point, if you can find some new articles or some new ideas for like evidence and that sort of thing that are not like generic arguments, you can whip that out in elimination rounds, surprise your opponents. Maybe they don't have blocks prepared for that. It's always a good strategy to knock your opponents off their blocks. Or, as a person who's judged a lot of debate rounds, sometimes you get really sick of hearing the same arguments over and over and over again. And you're like, oh, something new. Well, yeah, that's cool. 29.5 speaker points. It also just helps you like get a fundamental understanding of the topic. So, first of all, like search engines, don't just like type a phrase into Google, because, like the most novicey of novices can do that. It's important to utilize your search engines to your benefit. So one thing I highly recommend is using like any sort of academic database like LexisNexis that you have access to. I use a thing called, I don't know how to say it, but Cengage Learning, Cengage. That is a wonderful resource in finding evidence that not everyone else has access to. And no matter what search engine you're using, these sort of things can help you refine your searches. Because if you just type in climate change, you're going to get like a million results. I mean, not like a million, like a billion results. So one thing you can do is if you put a minus sign next to any word, it strikes out and eliminates any sort of article that you're looking for. So like, let's say you're looking for like impacts of pollution, and you want to talk about all the different types of cancer that pollution can provide or cause. And, you see like mostly like lung cancer from like air pollution, but you're pretty sure that pollution can cause other sorts of cancers. So if you just put lung minus lung, it removes any instance of articles that have that word in it. So you find other types of cancer. Another thing you can do is if you're looking for an exact phrase, putting quotation marks around a certain phrase will find that exact phrase in that exact context in your articles, right? Because otherwise, what search engines do is they search for any article with the combination of the words you search for, but not that exact phrase. Okay. Another thing you can do is check for advanced search options. This is available in almost every single search engine, whether it's Yahoo, Bing, Google, whatever you use. You can search by dates. You can search for a certain specific date range. Very important public forum debate, because usually they pick current events topics. And it's also good in other formats of debate when there's some sort of like conflict over two evidences that say two different opposing things. One thing that you can do is be like, hey, look, judge, my article is from last week. Their article is from 5 years ago. Things have changed over these 5 years. You should accept our evidence because it's more recent. Now, just because evidence is old doesn't mean it's bad. I have evidence from 2004 that says water's wet. Hold on, let me check. It's still wet in 2021. I have evidence that says Pluto's a planet in 2004. Guess what? Apparently that's not true anymore. So one thing you got to look out for are some common problems. One of the biggest thing is a lot of people read like evidence that's not very credible. I see this even a lot in like high level policy debate rounds where people will just read like blog posts or like like opinion articles by unqualified authors. It's really important to make sure that your evidence comes from a reliable source. It shouldn't be from like, even if it comes from like Wikipedia, make sure that your author has some sort of like expertise or credibility, that it's not just some random person writing their own opinions. One thing to look for is don't use Wikipedia. Now, I will say Wikipedia is useful as a start because Wikipedia provides a lot of links to outside sources that are valid, but Wikipedia itself should never be quoted in debate rounds or quoted in an academic article of any type. But it's a good starting point because the outside sources that Wikipedia can refer you to is a good way to find evidence that's valid. And I'll be saying this a lot for a lot of like secondary and tertiary sources, is to use the citations and the work cited as a way to find more primary sources to establish your authority and your credibility in when you're doing that. Okay, so let's go through some different types of sources. The first one I'll introduce you to is a think tank. Now, you got to look out for think tanks. The reason why think tanks publish a lot of things is because very wealthy people and organizations donate money to them. So, like Brookings Institute, Cato Institute, the Rand Corporation, American Enterprise Institute, like these sort of things, publish a lot of like articles, and they get quoted a lot in debate, and they generally do good research. However, they tend to do a lot of cherry picking, and they tend to be biased. Like one time, Cato Institute once published an article about how secondary smoke is not dangerous for you. So if someone is in a room smoking a cigarette, it's not harmful to your health. Well, guess what? Cato Institute also received a $5 million donation from a tobacco company. So, or, like some of these, especially like foreign like think tanks that focus on international relations, will be like, this country is a threat. By the way, we are funded by defense contractors. Like Lockheed Martin gives them money. Lockheed Martin sells weapons. If it's established that this country is a threat, then Lockheed Martin can sell more weapons. So I would say that these sort of sources are, they do good research. Usually their research is valid, but their motivations and their sort of like biases and cherry picking can kind of like undermine their sort of validity. What I would recommend doing is that instead of quoting directly these think tanks, you read their citations and see like what sort of outside sources they're using and what sort of primary sources they're using to come to their conclusions. Because look, when you're debating, you're biased too. You're cherry picking evidence. You're doing these sort of things. So these can help you find some good sources, but you have to be careful about it. Okay. Periodicals. Periodicals are things that are published either daily, weekly, or monthly, like newspapers and magazines. New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Scientific American, Time Magazine, even things like CNN, like news websites, that sort of thing, right? You get so I will tell you that I don't know if you're surprised by this, but especially in public forum, there's a lot of academic dishonesty where teams will just say, according to the New York Times, it says blah, 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 blah. And you're like, well, there's like literally thousands of issues of the New York Times. They've published hundreds of thousands of articles, maybe even millions by now, because, they've been around for a couple hundred years. What issue what date? Like what? Like, huh? uh? So, if your opponents are doing this, like they should be like having proper citations. There will be another video about like card cutting, and it'll include those sort of things to make sure that your citations are clean. You should always, if you're going to quote one of these sources, it's best that you quote the full like date, like the March 7th, 2018 edition of the New York Times says that blah 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 blah. That way there's no like disputes about the credibility of the evidence. Of course, you should never lie about your evidence. You should never like fake evidence. It'll set a really bad reputation for you in your debate circuit if you get caught by that. Judges in the debate community are very, close and related to each other. So if you have a reputation as someone who like clips cards or fakes evidence or that sort of thing, that can really hurt your chances of having any sort of success in the future. Now, in general, their news reporting is pretty good, though you got to look out for their opinion editorials, also known as like an op-ed. Those tend to be biased. Some of the authors are good. Others are like complete hacks and have like no credibility. So, and sometimes just because it's in the New York Times or something doesn't mean that it's great. It's more about the credibility of the author than the source of these sort of things, especially if it's an opinion editorial. Okay, journals. So journals are usually published by universities or a collection of universities, while think tanks and general news sites usually are accessible freely. These have the problem of costing money in most cases. Now, if you do have access to some sort of service like a LexisNexis or a JSTOR or one of the or another like sort of or Cengage or any sort of like academic database, you might be able to get these articles. Otherwise, you might have to pay for them. There are ways that you can get them, but I will not talk about it for obvious reasons because they're not exactly the most legal. Though if you're good at Google, I'm sure you can figure that out for yourself. These are the most legitimate sources because they go through a peer review process where they are heavily fact-checked, heavily revised, and edited until they are published. They're well-researched, well-evidenced. They have a lot of good information. They tend to be much less biased than a think tank. And, if it does come from like a really credible source, like a college professor, especially if you're debating in front of a lay judge, it's always good to use their full name, and when you're reading the evidence out loud, like their full name, their qualification, that sort of thing. Now, if you're debating in front of like a debate judge, you have an email chain going on, they're going to see that when they see the evidence. You don't have to say it out loud, but it's always good of a lay judge because who knows what's going on in their head. Okay, so I want to show you, when we're talking about biases, like one really good thing you can do is if you haven't heard the source before, you can go to a website called mediabiasfactcheck.com. Or if you simply Google fact check and the source, it'll usually direct you to this website. So in the search bar, you can either enter the name of the publication or the URL of the article you found. And it doesn't have everything, but it has the most common used sources, and it can tell you whether that source is acceptable or not. So this right here is the New York Times, and it says that the New York Times has a slight moderate to liberal bias. That's okay, right? As long as it's center left, center right, it's a fairly reputable source. More importantly is the factual reporting rating, which shows have they failed fact checks before? Have they published quote unquote fake news? You want to try to stay in the center. Now, if you do have a left or right biased article that has high factual reporting, it's usually because of the rhetoric they use, and like they kind of like use like loaded language. But it's factual, so it's okay. Now, this is the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire is what I call a spicy chicken. As a person who teaches debate in China, in Mandarin, the Chinese word for spicy chicken sounds almost exactly the same as the word for garbage. And so any sort of like garbage evidence, we call spicy chickens. This is Daily Wire. It's Ben Shapiro's newspaper. He's that like, guy who's like, guys, if facts don't care about your feelings. I really don't like him. He tends to rile up, like hate crimes and things like that. He's very disingenuous. I'm sorry if you're a Ben Shapiro fan watching this. I guess, too bad. So he has a right bias almost to the extreme on his publication, a mixed factual reporting rating. This would be a source that would not be acceptable to use in a debate round because the evidence is questionable. So using this sort of website, you can make sure that you're using good, reputable sources. Because I have seen on ballots, that oh, you use the Heritage Foundation, the judges know, especially well-read, scholarly judges. They'll see something like Fox News, and it'll be like, why are you reading Fox News in debate? Why are you reading the Heritage Foundation? Like, these sort of sources are biased. Oh, you're reading CNN. That's a liberal propaganda. Keep on trying to use things that fall into these ranges that have good credibility, and that will really help prevent any sort of judge intervention or your opponents checking the credibility or attacking the credibility of your evidence. Now, I will say a lot of people read these extremely biased evidence in policy, Lincoln Douglas public forum, and it doesn't get questioned. And I think honestly, questioning this sort of evidence should happen a lot more often. Okay, let's talk about evidence packets. The good thing about evidence packets is it gives you a series of cards that you can use, especially if you're doing public forum or Lincoln Douglas where the topic changes often, or if you want to have good grades in school and you can't spend all your time cutting cards, or you want to have a social life. The evidence packet can do a lot of saving of time for you. And there's a lot of different packets out there. I won't say their names because I don't want to play favorites. And honestly, over time, I've noticed that certain packets go in cycles of being good, and then they're bad, and then they're good again, and they're bad. So I'm not going to name any. But you can do your own research and talk to your friends, see what sort of evidence packets they like. Maybe your school buys you packets. I don't know. So when you're going through it, when you're going through it, they do a lot of help for you. They have cards. You only need to read. I would say if you can skim through that, find evidence that supports you. The bold and underline part. I would say read the entire card, and even read the original article. The bold and underline are things that you can read out loud, but read the entire article so you actually understand it, and you can understand the underlying assumptions. Often I notice a lot of packets under highlight evidence, and there's a lot of good stuff in there that you could also use. But hey, it's a really good start in your research. The good things about the evidence packets is, number one, a lot of the evidence in the packets comes from websites that are behind a paywall, meaning that you would not otherwise be able to access that evidence without paying money or having access to an academic database. It summarizes the core areas. It gives you an idea of what are going to be the main generic contentions. And you get a solid fundamental background. The bad thing about the packets are these things are out there. If you read evidence from the packets, your opponents will most likely be familiar with that evidence. Everyone has them. A lot of kids trade them, that sort of thing, with their friends. There's camp files that are out there from the Open Evidence Project, that sort of thing. There's also no guarantee that evidence is going to be good. Let me tell you, I know a lot of people who used to work for evidence packets. They care a lot more about quantity of evidence than quality of evidence because, hey, guess what? They're getting paid. And a lot of these people are college students making these. They're not debate coaches. When I cut evidence and when I cut cards for my students, I make sure that the evidence is actually useful, it has good warrants, and has some sort of purpose. Some people, and I'm not saying all packets are like this, but a lot of packets that I encounter, they just care about having a lot of cards, sending it out there so they can get paid and make money. And hey, you know, that's how the world works sometimes. But if you're reading these, you're not going to surprise anyone. That's why I highly suggest you do your own research, find your own arguments. You can use packets as like a starting point in the research to save some time. But you got to do, if you want to be successful, especially on the national circuit, it's really important that you and your teammates do research, work together to have a lot of success. Okay, well, that's pretty much it on my introduction to research. I hope you find this very enlightening, and I'll see you for the next video.